Greetings, friends. This video is addressed to some Americans, many of whom are only online, and it's addressed to some Canadians, many of whom are online. I don't know what the real world, daily life contingent of these people are. It's something you see on the website X, which is not real life. It's just a distorted slice of real life. But the US president is talking continuously about the 51st state idea, and therefore there are real people that are going to be influenced by that message. So in keeping with one of my recent videos where I discussed the validity of Canadian identity, problematic as it is, it does have problems, but it is a nation. Canada historically has had an identity. In keeping with that, I want to discuss specifically more this idea of the 51st state, how some are viewing it positively, how some people are reacting to it. As I've said, most Americans are our friends, and historically they are our kin group. So this is not with any ill will to Americans. Now obviously when they talk of the 51st state, it is viewed by many as a negotiating tactic because Trump does this tactic. He says something wild. He sees who's weak and who will stand up to him, and then he gets a bargain or a deal out of that. That's a loose way to view the situation. Perhaps that's what's going on here. It would make sense with the tariffs. But he's been harping on it long enough now that it's not a joke anymore. You can't really be sure what the future portends. Now, it's a joke in that it's not going to happen now because it's impossible. You could militarily do it, but there's no political will to have a military invasion of Canada. So there's no real will or even capacity for this administration, with all the things it wants to do, to focus on incorporating Canada, the second largest landmass in the world, incorporating that into the US. That would be a long, difficult process. I'm not saying it couldn't be done. I'm not saying there's some scenario in the future where perhaps that could happen. But I don't think any serious person in the Trump administration wants to get bogged down with that, because it would be a task. Some people, it gives them a sense to say that, like, we're stronger than you and we could easily take your country and there's nothing you can do about it. So it satisfies some of those people. We can take Greenland. We can be an empire again. This is nuts. Yes, there's a global American empire, but that it had its day and it's on its way down. The debt, the deficit, overextending the military. It's plausible to imagine something like this happening in the century, maybe. I just don't see it happening right now. But the question would be incorporation. The question would be, how many states are you going to actually add? Because it's not going to be the 51st state. You'd be adding probably another 10 states, 9 or 10 states, because every province would have to become a state. Maybe you could blend some of the provinces together. The provinces are huge. They're small ones in the Maritimes, but most of the provinces are gigantic. Some of the provinces are like basically as big as Texas, I don't know, give or take, or California, in terms of area. Now I know you could say, oh, well, that's administratively just a territory, whatever. Yeah, but you've had peoples living in these areas like for many generations that view themselves almost as like little mini countries, like Canada being kind of a commonwealth, like a mini empire. Quebec and then Ontario. The Maritimes are quite different. The West is different. Manitoba, especially Alberta. Alberta has a secessionist or a separatist sentiment for a long time. They feel that they have been shortchanged by the East, and they have valid complaints about that. Many people point out that Alberta is very culturally similar to Middle America, cowboy culture, agrarian, big open spaces, oil drilling. They like more low taxes, that kind of a big business sort of environment. That could lead to Alberta being very receptive to becoming part of the United States. That's the only thing that might make more sense to me. That's the only thing that I could see, maybe that might happen. I do prefer to see the country of Canada preserved as it is. So I guess from my perspective, that would be not desirable, but I could understand why that might happen. So when it comes to the West, perhaps there's some real things to consider there. But even in the West, there's many different factions there. There's many liberals also in the West. It's not purely right-wing. Part of British Columbia is conservative and part of it's very left-wing, like Vancouver and all the urban areas along the coast, super liberal and also very Chinese and very brown. So you're going to get all of that in state number 53 or 454. So you're not getting the 51st state. You're getting a number of other states. And how are you going to get Quebec? You're never going to get Quebec to agree to this. They've been forced down by globalization too, but the Anglo-Canadians have been forced down and demoralized way worse than the Quebecois. Yes, the Quebecois have been demoralized to an extent, but it's not to the same extent as the Anglos. And at that point, Quebec would just separate from Canada and you'd have the country of Quebec. And if you tried to attack the Quebecois militarily, assuming that you had all the rest of Canada already under the US and now you're like coming at Quebec militarily, you would deal with Quebec terrorists. I think that's bad, but I'm just saying that's something you would have to bring into your political calculus. And why would you want that headache? Many Americans, I think, realize that they don't want Canada. Many of them say that. So you've got some people in the MAGA movement who are like, yeah, this is a great flex. This would be good for our empire, for our economy. Maybe legitimate arguments. The bullshit is how they're like, oh, well, it'll be great for you as Canadians. Like, well, we'll get into that. But then you've got the majority of Americans who realize, I think, that this is a ridiculous idea because you're going to, at least all the conservatives, because you're going to get all of these liberal voters. You're going to get Ontario. Do you want Ontario? We're going to turn you Democrat. You want BC? We'll turn you blue. It doesn't make sense from the American perspective if you want to stay Republican red, because Canada is more on the left-wing side. But yes, we do have so-called right-wing people. I mean, everyone's just a liberal now anyways. We all believe in feminism anyways. But relatively speaking, yeah, you have less of them in Canada than you do in the US, proportionately. It depends on the area. It depends on the background. If you really want some of Canada, then just focus on Alberta. Just do a propaganda campaign right now. Focus on Alberta and the West. If you really want something in the next 10 years, or at least if the next administration is Republican ones, then that would be my advice to you. But I don't say that as someone who wants to see Alberta go. On my case, from the Canadian standpoint, I think it would be better to remain in Canada, even as the position where they have complaints, rather than join the US, which is just going to dominate you even more. Like, think of the political representation. People say, well, you're going to get the same political representation because you'll just be represented in Congress, just like any other state. Well, a nation of 40 million inhabitants will be joining a nation of what, more than 400 million, roughly? So we'll be now in a political pool. And I don't believe in democracies because it's just mob rule, but we'll be in the situation where now there'll be 400 million more people who had no connection to our country, really. Now we'll be voting with them. And if you do the electoral system with our population, we're not going to qualify for nearly that many electoral seats. Like, how many electoral seats would Manitoba get? There's not many people living in Manitoba. It's not going to have very many electoral seats in the system. So proportionately, Manitoba can influence the federal government in Canada, in Ottawa, more than it will be able to influence Washington, all things considered. I mean, sure, maybe in some scenarios they have a strong lobby that can pull it off. But no, I mean, obviously, from the big picture, at least from a general picture, we'd be going into this electoral system where we're going to be less represented. And we have all these resources here, which we know the American empire really wants, just like the global American empire wanted to break up Russia and get the resources there. That's one of the reasons for the Ukraine war. I'm not saying regular Americans want that, but the rulers of the empire, they look greedily on the world in those terms. And I think that's part of how they're looking at Canada too. It is a lot of natural resources, minerals, timber, oil. Now, directed more towards the Canadians who are like maybe so-called Maple MAGA, like they really love the MAGA movement, but they're Canadians, and they're supporting this idea of the U.S. annexing Canada. They're just like, well, we'll get less taxes and we'll get constitutional rights. For the cynicism and the shallow material wants of these people, like Black Pigeon Speaks, he had a video where he describes how bad Canada has become over the Justin Trudeau years, more generally over the last 40 years or so. And then at the end, he's just sort of like, yeah, let's join the states because less tax and more money. There wasn't any like deeper reason to do it. And I'm like, my goodness, Black Pigeon Speaks must be just such a cynical nihilist. He just came across as a loser. You're a loser. You want to just surrender your nation, your whole heritage. Like, does that mean nothing to you? Maybe it doesn't. And if you want to, in that sense, preserve your heritage, there's no easy way to do that and just surrender your country to a large hegemon south of you, which your forefathers fought several civil wars to maintain independence from. There's no way to maintain any sense of dignity and do that. It's just a complete surrender. It doesn't matter ultimately that your people shall be subjected to material deprivation if they get to keep their dignity as best they can. We all know that sometimes countries are conquered, but that doesn't mean that inhabitants have no choice, or at least it doesn't mean that they have to make the choice just from the outset to assume that we have to do this because the US is going to crush us. They're going to crush us with tariffs, and they may, and they are. They're beginning to do that. My employer ships 75% approximately of its product, office furniture, to the United States. Who knows what could happen? We don't know what could happen. There obviously will be people losing their jobs if these tariffs are implemented. Would that make me want to say, well, we just got to be part of the states? He showed his force. Trump showed his force over us. We just got to be part of the states. No, that's not going to motivate me to want to be part of your system because you did that. Whatever the argument for the tariffs are, whether they're justified or not, I'm just saying the idea of using economic force to overwhelm a country, that would inspire the people to like the country using the economic force against them. That's not going to motivate me. Maybe it'll motivate Black Pigeon Speaks. Maybe it'll motivate a bunch of these maple MAGA-tards because they just want more rights. We don't want rights or liberty. We've tried that. That's an Enlightenment thing. We want order. We want monarchy. And quite frankly, we need a real monarchy. In Canada, it's good that we have King Charles, who has a connection to orthodoxy through his father, I believe. We actually need a real king in Canada, and that may seem like a dream or a ridiculous idea, but we live in ridiculous times, and it's not beyond the pale to start thinking seriously about such things as a monarch of Canada, like actually up for the Canadian people. Like we maintain connection to Britain and the Commonwealth, but we have a king of Canada. That's the only way we're going to survive if we move on from liberal democracy, if our elite class is replaced. How do we get this elite class to do that? The elites are never going away. You'd have to get some of the elite groups to agree to be a monarch. It would have to be either the Western elite or the Laurentian elite or the Quebecois elite. I don't know who's going to do it. You might actually have to choose a Quebecois elite. That might be the only way. We have a French king ruling Canada. That's the only way it could work, maybe, because otherwise you wouldn't get Quebec in on it. Otherwise, Quebec will have to separate, and we'll have an English king, like Anglo-Canadian king, ruling Canada, a Canadian dynasty. But you'd have to pull it from the elites, because it would never work pulling someone from the masses to do that. I don't know if that's ever happened in history. But the elites right now are against the people, so we're not there yet. But that doesn't mean you can't consider and seriously think about this. The old flag has to be brought back. We have to do away with the maple leaf. The maple leaf is emasculated. It doesn't have the same connection to the heritage, the symbols. And I had one American telling me, you'll get to keep your property when we conquer you. So don't worry, you'll have your rights and your property. And hold on, we're going to lose our property. And he was speaking in the technical sense, like you'll still have your house and all that. Yeah, nice way of speaking about it. But yes, the Canadian people, at least our heritage, this will no longer be our land. So we're going to lose our land. You can be poor and own your land. Yeah, I had one Canadian guy who was already sold. He's like, we got to surrender right now to America because, boy, the economic hammer is coming. And I was arguing with him, and he was telling me how you're going to be at the back of the bread line. You're going to be back of the bread line, back of the food line. I don't know how I'll respond in those circumstances. Maybe I'll break. Maybe they'll break me. But you can't just say at the outset that we should surrender. You have to at least maintain some idea that, yes, it would be good to resist. He couldn't understand. I was trying to tell him, it's the same thing as happened during lockdowns and vax mandates. They were threatening you with loss of material privileges, possibly loss of employment, prevention of travel, many other real physical consequences on your daily life because of your decision to either not mask or to not receive a mandated injection. Because of those decisions to not go along, to not participate, to disagree, to say no, we were subjected to material hardship. Now, was it therefore the right thing to do? To accept the stabby, to accept the mask in all cases, so that we could preserve our material comforts? Was that the right thing to do? Well, I'll leave that to you. But the guy couldn't understand what I was getting at all. He couldn't understand. I mean, maybe he was one of them. I don't think so, though. Because I think a lot of the freedom people that were in the freedom movement, so-called, against lockdowns and mandates, I think a lot of them are maple magatards because there were always Canadian American flags and Trump banners. You'd see that a lot in the freedom movement. I was there for a year and a half, almost 2 years, every Saturday, Queen's Park. When we went on many marches. I did go to the Ottawa convoy for a weekend. I did see it. I respect Trump. He's definitely means business. He's firm, but he's not our friend, obviously. And that's a shame because I would love to support Trump and have generally thought positively of him. I interacted with a progressive nationalist online, on X. So here's an interesting thing. Nationalism can actually be left-wing and has historically often been left-wing, and you can even make the argument, as Sargon did, that nationalism originally, at least as an ideology, was left-wing because it came out of the French Revolution. Now, of course, that's not how nationalism is understood today. Many people, probably the majority of people that think of themselves as nationalists today in the Western world, would be on the right, so to speak. However, that could change. Ireland, historically in the 19th century, up until recently, was characterized by left-wing nationalism. It is possible, at least for the old model of the left, pre-woke, to be nationalist and to have left-wing or socialist policies. I mean, even Trump's doing aspects of that with tariffs, right? Because I met this other guy online and he's like, yes, I am a progressive nationalist. And I was like, wow, I mean, like you and I would be at odds normally, but if you oppose annexation and bullying from our southern neighbor, well, I'm happy to welcome you. These liberals who will let themselves be force jabbed and face bandaged under home arrest, treated like absolute cattle. Well, I mean, that's the thing. The same tendency of cattle that was used on the liberals during the COVID years can get them to behave as cattle to preserve Canada as a state, independent. I'm not saying that's necessarily good or bad, but it's a political fact. You could get them into a nationalist movement. You could. So I was doing the editing for this video, and I came across this video on YouTube by the Toronto Sun where Brian Lilley interviewed Steve Bannon, and making the final cut, they had about 20 minutes of Bannon being interviewed, and Brian Lilley had traveled, I guess, to Washington to interview Bannon on the question of Canada being the 51st state, and he was trying to have a serious discussion to really get some concrete answers as to how seriously this is taken in Washington, and what would that look like? What are sort of the main motivations behind this? Bannon sort of spoke in a way where he wasn't giving the most clear answers. And at the end of it, all I could boil down that he said regarding why the US would annex Canada was the Arctic being a security concern because of China, Russia, and other global competitors, and that Canada really hadn't done enough to secure the Arctic, which is true. Canada is behind in that. I don't deny that. But as a rationale to annex Canada? because of the Arctic thing being insecure, that to me is a bit of a stretch. And the only other thing I gleaned from that 20 minutes of Bannon talking was he said, well, Western Canadians are very culturally similar with Americans. So that's another argument that's just thrown around. Well, because you're culturally similar to us, we should have power over you. So Austria should be annexed by Germany because they're culturally similar, right? Maybe, maybe not, I don't know, but I don't think that's a very strong argument on its own. It was kind of a bizarre interview, and Bannon was careful enough to give credit to the Canadians, like, oh, you guys fought in World War I, you guys made sacrifices in Normandy in World War II. So he's trying to butter up some of the older crowd. I thought that was a bit rich because it's well, what do you think those guys would think? What do you think those guys would think about the question of Canada being taken over by the US today? Hold on a second here. You can't appeal to those people and not address what their mindset. I mean, I don't know. I don't know too many Canadian veterans, so what am I to say? I don't know. But that's all I could get from the interview. So this is a Canadian real journalist, Brian Lilley. I don't know too much about him, but he's actually gone there to try and figure out what's going on, and he didn't really achieve that. We still don't really know. Hasta luego, amigos.